I don't know that this is true, but when I look around today and I see that there are still so few women in really responsible jobs in kitchens, and when you look at the James Beard Awards every year, it's men, 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 and you look at, like, you know, what's going on at the Time Warner Center, and you've got these big restaurants opening, it's all men.
We still see a real dearth of women at the very top. 15% for round numbers of executive chefs in America are women. However, I don't believe that that's much different than the rest of the world. So we've never had a woman president or vice president. What percentage of CEOs or bank presidents or heads of Fortune 500 companies are women? Not very many. Part of that is societal, or maybe all of it's societal, but with a couple different viewpoints. One is that, you know, men have always been in positions of power and don't necessarily want to share. So that's historically in all professions. I mean, if you look at thoracic surgeons, you know, there's not a whole lot of women there. In huge positions of power, women have always struggled, although I think that that's changing across the board in all areas. What's different with the food service industry and cooking is that women have always and continue to feed the planet, so why women wouldn't be in positions of power in the culinary world is a little different.
First kitchen that I worked in that was like intense was a seafood place down in the Jersey Shore, first of all. And that was like my first experience with just understanding what kind of core you had to have as a woman in a kitchen, I think. And I never thought of myself walking in the kitchen like, oh God, I'm a woman and I'm gonna be, you know, I never had that mentality going in. But I happened to be on one of the busiest seafood restaurants in the summertime on the Jersey Shore. They threw me on 4 fry-laters, and they were all like, you know, all men, and a kind of a rough crowd. And they would just kind of like, oh yeah, watch her sink, you know. And I kept my head into it. I listened to their advice, and I worked hard. I worked through it, and I was able to do the job. And I think that from that came some respect in the kitchen.
I did an event maybe last year or the year before, and the way the event was scheduled was that a chef would take a turn cooking at a party that was going to go for the night, and you would do your half an hour stint, and then you would be replaced by another chef, and so customer or guests at this event would be able to come up and see you for the time that you were there cooking. And I arrived to do my stint on the grill, and these 2 very well-known men chefs in New York were sweating, and the smoke was coming off the grill, and they really looked like they could use a beer and a break. And I said, hey, you guys, why don't you go? I'm here for my stint. And they both looked up and they're like, honey, why don't you hand those out? And I was like, I sure will. I mean, what are you gonna do? It's so, they want you to get mad, you know? It's so designed to piss you off. And I just sort of took the platter and turned around. I was like, great, can I offer you a, you know, pig in a blanket or whatever that we were making? I just couldn't believe it. Unbelievably blatant and good. Why don't you just hand those out, honey?
So I'm at a station checking. I had to check the station every day in the morning to make sure we were ready for service. So I'm going through all the drawers, pulling them out to make sure, and I bend over, and one of the guys is walking behind me, and he starts making horse sounds. That type of thing. I ran into that. So I was able to deal with it with a sense of humor with some of them, because I knew that it was, you know, somewhat in fun, but at the same time it was kind of, it made me feel like, you know, had I been a different person, would I have been treated that way? Because I doubt it.
I was waitressing at one restaurant and went into the walk-in to get creamers, and one of the cooks came in there and touched me and kissed me, and, you know, it was harassment, and I was just kind of like, whoa, you know, but I never told anyone about it. I told people who I worked with, you know, kind of like that was weird, but it never took it to any other kind of legal level.
For a short while, I did 2 live shows for 8 months. I did one from 7 to 8 and one from 10 to 11. And that was 4 nights a week. And for each show, we would have 3 guests. We had sort of regular correspondence. They changed after a while. And then we'd have 2 chefs on. And the majority were men, because that's what you usually find. We tried to find women. And particularly with the 10 o'clock show is when we had all those millions of chefs. The 7 o'clock show, I'd have a guest on maybe 1/3 of the time. But the 10 o'clock show, because we had to have so many guests, we couldn't screen them as well, talk to them as much. And I really hated it, because this is the beginning of the era when everybody thought they were going to be discovered and become famous and be on TV. So they'd get on the show and they wouldn't know anything about me. If you're going to go on somebody's show and they're the host, you can bet the person's watching the show because they like the host. So guess what? Be nice to the host. If you're rude to the host, they're not going to like you. Well, I'd say 9 out of 10 of the chefs I had on my show didn't get that, didn't understand that, didn't care. They treated me like a cross between Vanna White and a Happy Little Housewife.
I had any discrimination or real horror stories, but they worked me and they, gave me the grunt jobs and tried to break me, but I wasn't breaking. I love the industry and I loved cooking, so I just stuck it out, and then, you win them over from they see your skills and if you have it in you to do it. But it is a hard profession, whether you're a man or a woman, and some people decide after they go to chef school that they don't particularly like the long hours and whatnot.
While there are many interpretations of early history, women have played a prominent role in food production since the beginning of time. In hunter and gatherer cultures, women were responsible for collecting food items like nuts, vegetables, and berries, while men were in charge of hunting animals. Due to sporadic hunting success, communities depended on women to provide a consistent food supply.
Women are also credited with, sort of inventing cooking, if you will, because they were also in one place. They used a lot of fire, and at least some anecdotal evidence says that women figured out that, cooking meat was better for you and tasted better.
As the world's cultures changed to become more stationary and agriculturally based, the workload of women increased. Women were now responsible for cultivating crops, taking care of children, and keeping their respective homes. Women shifted into a role as caretakers, food providers, and nurturers that would define them for centuries to come. At the same time, the responsibilities of men diminished. There was now more time for them to organize and define the future of their communities. As a result of political and other societal changes, formerly egalitarian societies now altered their power structure to put men ahead of women.
Women have always fed the planet. They continue to feed the planet to this day, but have always historically fed the planet. And when we switched from a matriarchal to a patriarchal society, up until that point with the matriarchal society, women were the only people who cooked for anybody. And we went from the matriarchal system to a shaman system. One of the shamanic codes was that women were unclean during estrus, and so they couldn't cook for you. And then all of a sudden men started saying when women could cook and when they were clean and unclean, and so that sort of changed the whole paradigm of cooking as well.
There is much debate about the origin of the profession of cooking. According to some scholars, the cooking profession started during the 5th century BC. Other sources point to professional cooking really beginning during the Middle Ages. In 11th century France, guilds were formed to provide chefs with their first professional associations.
Sort of road to professional cooks started with the armies. And there were armies that were fighting. That's what we did. Cooks came from the armies, they came to the castles, they're cooking for the kings, they made guilds. And there was only 2 ways to get into the guilds. You could buy your way in, and women at that point were considered chattel. They couldn't own land and they couldn't own money, and their husband, father, brother was totally in charge of them, so women couldn't get in. Or you could be somebody's son, which also precluded women.
From this point onward, men dominated the professional kitchen. In order to separate themselves from the women who taught them, a rigid structure and uniform were adopted for professional guilds. The exclusion of women was calculated to elevate the status of the craft and separate it from the artisan and servant tradition from which it originated. The dominance of male chefs in the new profession was used, albeit through circular reasoning, as proof that men had superior skills in taste and innovation and were therefore more qualified. The Industrial Revolution also had a significant impact on culinary history, further defining the roles of women. Men started to leave their homes to work in factories, mines, mills, and men's workshops, while women were left at home to take care of family and other domestic duties. In fact, the first culinary schools in the 19th century were not utilized to train women to be professional chefs, but rather to train women on how to be better homemakers and servants. Auguste Escoffier, widely considered one of the greatest chefs who ever lived, is largely credited with creating the structure of the restaurant kitchen.
Now, Escoffier sort of is the father of the regard system. And from chef's uniforms, if you look at the uniforms, these uniforms were copied from Turkish military uniform. And so you really see this militaristic component. And then when Escoffier, who spent most of his early life in the army, started thinking about how to run kitchens, he said, well, he sort of set it up exactly like the army. So there's an executive chef, an executive sous chef, there's sous chefs, there's chef de parties, there's, commis. And if you looked at, and I don't know how it goes, but generals, lieutenants, sergeants, whatever, it was really the same structure, and it was all a male-based structure. There were no women in kitchens.
Because women weren't in the kitchen in the 18th and early 19th century, nor were they in the kitchen in the early 20th century, at least not in France. The French kitchen, in terms of high-quality private homes or restaurants, were exclusively male domains. You might have a female cook in a comfortable bourgeois household, but not in the very, very high end. It was a very sexist, very gender-specific type of employment.
I think we've been kept down by the French chefs. What happened was, very briefly, history of sort of food in this country is, in terms of haute cuisine, I think there was great home cooking going on around the country, but in terms of haute cuisine, it really happened when Le Pavillon opened up, which is a great French restaurant in the 50s in New York City, and when Le Francais opened up in Wheeling, Illinois, and when the Kennedys hired Renee Verdun, and when Julia Child started being on TV. And suddenly, people were cooking with beautiful ingredients and saying, no, it's not iceberg lettuce anymore. And yes, you too can do this, and you should strive for more, and you can eat this incredible food in these restaurants. And suddenly we were like, wow, there's other food out there. There's something more exciting. The trouble was that the chefs, Le Pavillon spawned all these other incredible chefs. Alain Sayac, André Saltner, Jacques Pepin, I think Jean-Jacques Rousseau, many, many chefs who then went and opened their own restaurants in New York City. And they sort of had a stronghold on the city. And I think they're just now losing it, letting it go, or it's being taken away from them. And they would then encourage their own. They'd bring over other French chefs from France. They'd hire men and treat them in the classical way in the kitchen, which is very male-dominated, and not everybody's a screamer, but most of them are in the old French tradition. Women just could not penetrate that. When I came out of cooking school in the late 70s, and then I worked in restaurants, I could not get into a kitchen, any of those really great kitchens in New York City. I interviewed at a place that was one of the best restaurants in the country. And the chef, I had a nice introduction from Julia Child and from Sally Dar, who I ended up working with at La Tulipe in New York City. And he was totally charming. He was just delightful. We had a wonderful time. And he said, I'm sorry I don't have anything. And I left the restaurant. I went back to the job I had, which was with my girlfriend as her sous chef at a restaurant downtown. And one of the waiters said, oh, you went to that restaurant and you tried to apply for a job there? He said, you've got to be kidding. He said, I overheard the chef, the one you interviewed with, the famous chef, saying he'd rather close his restaurant than hire a woman.
When I came here, it was no one single American. I don't want to say no one single male American. It was no male, no female American in the kitchen.
Years ago when I started, they did not want women in the kitchen, and they did not want even American men in the kitchen. It was a whole European oasis and domain, and it was only, the heavy French, German, and Swiss and Italian chefs. Even though it made me laugh because I asked them all, had they learned to cook and where they start, and the answer was my mother and my grandmother. But they wouldn't let a woman in the kitchen.
The Culinary Institute of America, previously known as the New Haven Restaurant Institute, opened in 1946 in downtown New Haven, Connecticut. The school changed locations twice, finally finding its current home in 1972 in Hyde Park, New York. While very few women did enroll at the CIA close to its inception, in 1948, Patsy Capaldo and Julianne Feldman were the first women to graduate. CAA was also the alma mater to Lyde Buchton-Kirk, the first woman to become a master chef. Another historical reason that there are not more women in the restaurant kitchen can be linked to the feminist movement. As women were encouraged to get out of the kitchen and into the workforce, the last field they wanted to enter was cooking or anything related to domesticity. For women, cooking was directly associated with serving their husbands and families. Entering the kitchen was considered counterproductive to the feminist movement. Additionally, the career choice of a chef was not recognized as a legitimate profession by the US Department of Labor until 1976.
There's a lot of women who really thought they needed to get out of the kitchen. There's a generation of women, some of the generation a little older than I am, who were basically taught, get out of the kitchen. You know, if you want to have careers, if you want to be on equal footing, if you want to be just like guys, you got to get out of the kitchen, don't cook anymore, you know, burn your bras and throw away your wooden spoons.
The idea of cooking as a profession with feminist things of you should be professionals carrying briefcases or stethoscopes or whatever is just anathema. I mean, my own mother is horrified that I gave up a professional career to stand in front of a hot stove, because that's just not what women of a certain generation coming of age in the 1970s were supposed to do.
While it has been a battle, women have made their way into the restaurant kitchens of the United States. Throughout the 1980s, women fought to prove their abilities, and in 1992, Deborah Ponzak became the first female chef to receive 3 stars from the New York Times at Montrachet.
It's a very strange thing about what's happened with women chefs. When I was still at New West magazine it must have been 1980 or 81, I did a story about women chefs and about how women chefs were coming, and it focused on, I was in California, so it focused on 5 women chefs. They all had horror stories. I mean, Mary Sue's story was sort of the opening story about how she went through years of serious cooking school, and when she got out, she went to Le Perroquet. She was living in Chicago, and she went to Le Perroquet and asked for a job. And Jovan Trbojevic, who was then the owner of the best restaurant in Chicago, looked at her and offered her a job as a coat check girl. And she went every day for a year asking if she could have a job in the kitchen. And after a year, she finally wore him down, and he gave her a job in the kitchen. And a year later, she was running the kitchen. But they all had stories like this. Every one of them had had horrible things, water thrown at them, been forced to carry 100-pound sacks up and down stairs. And they all toughed it out, and they were going to do this profession. And we all thought that this was just the beginning, and that in 10 years or 15 years, there would be parity in the kitchens, and that there would certainly be as many women executive chefs as men. And I think partly it's women themselves made this choice, that it's very difficult to get to a certain point in your life and have to make that choice between, am I going to have a family, or am I going to work 18 hours a day?
I think that young women coming out of school are starting out. This is just my own guess, and they are moving, and advancing in the industry. But I do think that by the time you have enough under your belt to reach those levels, you're talking, now you're 30 some years old, and it just happens to kind of marry with the same time that you're starting relationships, or you're starting to want to have children, or that stuff plays, at least for me personally, it's played a huge role in my career choices, and it's definitely sent me in a different direction than maybe I wanted to go in as a culinarian.
Children need their moms. So when it gets to the point that you want to have kids, it's very hard to work in a restaurant unless, in a few exceptions, such as Jody Adams or Lydia Shire, you have a husband who's willing to stay at home and be the dad and the mom. But I just came up against that wall and I never got past it. Because you're working 80 hours a week, you're just not there. I mean, I work full time, but I see my kids. I wouldn't if I was in the restaurant industry.
You want to have a family. You want to be a caregiver for your children. I think it's like in our genes to feel that that's what we should be doing. And I think any woman who, I mean, I have my own business and I have a family and a child and I'm forever conflicted. But I can get home at 8 or 9 and put my son to bed. You look at, you know, a Jody Adams who has a restaurant, successful, 2 restaurants, maybe 3 now, 2. You know, she's not getting home to put her kids to bed. And that's, I mean, maybe she is, but, you know, hypothetically, and that's a choice that she has to make. And I think women, it's very hard for a woman to make that decision, a very conscious decision.
When you're in a restaurant environment, I think that it's so inflexible. You have to be there to serve your customers. You have to be there when food goes out. So it's not like you can say, okay, I'm going to leave, I'm going to go home, put the kids to bed, and then I'm going to prep for Sunday brunch. You know, you can't do that. As somebody else in a different position might be able to go home, put their kids to bed, and then go hit the computer or do other types of work. And you can't do that when you're in a physical environment.
This industry is very demanding in time and dedication. I know that in those days, I did 12-hour days, 16-hour days. I still do, 32 years later, owning 5 restaurants and all of the rest, I still put in a 10-hour day at least. It's just the nature of the business. And to raise children, to have children, and to be continually on the job all these hours is almost impossible unless the woman has some sort of support. In my case, I had family support. I had my mother, and again, you know, I owned the restaurant, so maybe I could make some leeways here and there.
You know, you really have to have a good understanding. If you don't own your own business, then you have to have a good understanding with the people that you work for. That, you know, one day I'm going to want to have a child, and you know, if I need to take a month off to have a kid, am I going to be replaced? You know, and you sort of dread having the conversation. I haven't been able to have it yet, but I have to.
While the difficulty of having a family is said to be the primary reason for the lack of women at the executive chef level, there are many other obstacles that women have to face.
Men are taken more seriously in general. Just from my experience of having worked with different people, I've had people tell me things like, you have a really good work ethic for a woman, which is kind of an odd statement, as if women just don't have good work ethics. And so, you know, in that respect, they might not be taking it seriously, so they don't get as far ahead, because they don't get those jobs.
And I don't think an all-male kitchen, predominantly male kitchen on the East Coast, is a happy place for females. I just don't. I mean, I've been in them, and you've got to fight. Then if you're into fighting, that's one thing. If you're into sort of being aggressive, I think you can sustain that for a short amount of time. But for me, I get tired of that. I mean, I cook because I get energy from cooking, and I love to nurture people.
When the French chefs were dominating the scene and they wouldn't have a woman in their kitchen, there was a real feminist thing of, I'm going to show them and I'm going to go in there and I'm going to be as tough as they are and I'm going to bring those walls down. I don't think it exists much anymore.
I might not have gotten the job, you know, if I came in and I was shy about burning myself. I mean, you know, I'm covered in burns and cuts. If I were shy about that sort of pain, and if I was unable to carry things, you know, they wouldn't give me as many shifts because they need someone who can do that. So most of the girls who I work with in the kitchen are strong. They're kind of tough.
For a long time I did that very tough-ass, filterless cigarette smoking. I'm going to lift things twice as heavy as you're going to lift. I can do it faster. I can piss in a bottle. I can eat raw meat, you know, just burns and cuts, and no one's going to, you know. I did it for a long time, and now I don't.
It's you naturally act like a guy because it's just this, you know, hard, sweaty, you know, you're pumped up, you're pumping out food. I mean, you can't help. It's just like a sport, you know. It's like if I was playing basketball with men.
You are profoundly aware, though, of how much more you work and how much better you work than some of your male peers just to be considered equal. It's stupid and unbelievable.
Women, it's so funny, they say you can't stand the pressure, you can't stand the heat, you can't stand the stress. There is nothing more painful than giving birth, I can testify. There's nothing more stressful than being a mother and having a full-time job. Women don't complain the way men do when they're sick or when it's hot or when it's cold or when it's anything. Again, gross generalization, but that's been my observation. I think women are extremely well equipped to work in the kitchen.
Within yourself, you have something to prove and you're feeling insecure about whether or not you as a woman can perform this job, and then consequently try to come in and like work double hard and do things that other people wouldn't, you know, that you would normally ask for help for. You're bound to either make a mistake or get burned out. And there you go, you're not a cook anymore. You can get another job.
You know, they'd say, oh, you can't lift those pots and pans. Well, you don't have, all you need to do is use your brain and figure out a pivot with a friend to dump over a stock pot. Or classic examples, I had to make souffles. My last job was as chef tournant. So one night a week I had to do desserts and I had to make souffles. I had to do like 6 batches. And my boss wanted me to beat the egg whites by hand. We had this big copper bowl. But I'm short, the counter was high. So if I did it on the counter, my elbow would be up. And that would be a waste of energy and stupid, and I wouldn't, you know, last. So I figured it out. I just went over and found there was a shelf with some pots and pans on it that had a second shelf down. So I just figured out how to put the bowl down, and then when I beat my elbow was down, I wasn't wasting energy anymore. So it's not all about brawn. It's certainly about brain.
Can take maybe a 25 gallons, marmite and lift by himself. If she's going to call another person, man or woman, say, could you help me? That's the only difference. But that difference in the kitchen, on all kitchen now, disappear little by little. Why? Because technically speaking, we have a lot of machines. When we were making stock before, you have to lift a lot. Now you don't lift, you turn, and you put the liquid in them. So man or woman, can do it.
I think it's all up here. I mean, you could be 100 pounds and 5 feet tall and be a successful chef. I firmly believe that. If you believe in yourself.
The greatest challenges to women being chefs at this point are our own and other people's perceptions. I think, again, women do have to break down the perceptions in their own mind and sometimes the perceptions in the minds of the people across the table, across the kitchen.
It drives me crazy when people introduce me as a female chef, as just a supposed chef. And I don't know why there has to be a distinction for that. Like female, just as I was asked by somebody, so what is it like to be Asian and female? And I was like, number one, I don't walk around thinking that I'm Asian, and number two, you don't think of yourself in those terms.
I have never liked the idea of women artists or women actors or women writers. I mean, I think there are great writers and there are great chefs, and as a woman, I'm very excited when I come upon a woman who I think is a great chef. But I would never do, for instance, an issue on women chefs because I think it's a little insulting. I think it sort of says that we're at a place where we aren't.
While it is impossible to differentiate the food prepared by male versus female chefs, in general there seems to be some differences regarding behavior and management style in the kitchen.
There's clearly a management style, a behavioral style that in general women have that are different from men. And if you go to a lot of management training and stuff these days, you'll hear talk about trying to equalize these styles. And women tend to be more collaborative. They tend to be more consensus driven. They tend to be more nurturing. Men in general tend to be more dictatorial, more autocratic, less democratic, but I would say this is everywhere, and kitchens are just one place where you see this.
I've worked with all women, I've worked with all men, and I've worked with a mix. This is in restaurant kitchens. And I found that women were more even, this is a gross generalization, but the 7 years, this is what I saw, that women were much more even keel in a kitchen.
It feels to me, and this is such an opinion, that males will come from a place of and females will come from a place of da-da, 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 da-da. You know, we'll get it done, and this is how you do it, and this is blah, blah, blah. And a male will come from, did you get that?
Working with women, women like to make sure that everyone is happy, that everyone gives their opinion, and that everyone feels secure. At least this was my experience. And here, it's, you know, you just have to do your job. You know, the chef says, the chef asks you a question and your answer is always yes. It's just, we have a job that has to get done and it has to get done, and we're not going to waste a lot of time talking.
One of my better sous chefs, when he first started working for me as a line cook, was like completely blown away by how many women there were in the kitchen. Half my staff is always female, and it changes the dynamic. On any given night, if the girl's not there and it's just guys, there's less cooperation in the kitchen. I don't know why, you know. And it's not that these girls aren't tough, because, you know, you don't want to mess with Diane and Michelle. They're pretty, you know, they'll tell you where to get off, but it works really well. And I think it makes the guys nicer. So.
When I worked in a mixed kitchen, and a waiter would come back with a rack of lamb and say that the guest wanted to be cooked more, if the person on the grill was a man, he would swear at the waiter, he would yell up and down, he would throw the rack of lamb in the back of the broiler or grill or whatever he's cooking on, he would incinerate it, he would let it sit on the counter for a while, and then he would yell some more at the waiter and hand it back. The woman would say, okay, would not miss a beat, would put it on, would finish cooking it till it were well done, hand it back, no problem, no problem.
If you look at the way that males approach food as opposed to females, often I think the Certified Master Chef exam, for instance, is a way in which food has become a game of competition, of perfecting a skill, of getting better and better, and I think there's a place for that. And there's some females who may fit into that, and some who don't. And I think that the fact that there's only one Certified Master Chef may say something about whether a female fits into that type of environment.
Kitchen culture, especially the masculinization of the kitchen, is yet another factor that may keep women out of the restaurant.
I modeled myself after the guys. I mean, it was all I knew, and I behaved badly all the time. I mean, I'd yell at people, I'd scream, I'd throw things. That's because I've been being yelled at and had people throw things at me. And it dawned on me, you know, not too far into it, that I hated the way I was behaving and I hated the way I was acting, and was just buying into this belief that guys could behave badly and get away with it.
There's a lot of humor in restaurants, and a lot of that humor has a very nasty core to it, but so you get the sense that they're a fun, laid-back, humorous environment, but a lot of the humor was sort of derisive towards women, and they felt that. And I think over time, a lot of women leave the industry in part because of that.
The men who I'm friends with that are in the culinary program say some really off-color, disturbing, like just things that you cannot say without getting a lawsuit thrown your way, I feel like. And I was trying to figure out why that was. And the kitchen is really a deviant subculture in that people are more inclined to being rebellious. Like there's more loud music, there's more drugs, there's more partying, there's more tattoos. Just like the kitchen, usually, not in the culinary, but the kitchens in general. The kitchen is there's a higher level of people are more free. What is acceptable is a bit more relaxed, is what I should say. And so people come to this environment and still say the same things towards women or minorities.
All the women that I work with are pretty tough, I think, and they've worked in kitchens long enough, and I've also been able to hire a staff that's been pretty, there's a lot of ribbing going around, and they're like, babe, what you doing tonight, kind of thing, but it doesn't go beyond that point, and the girls are just as bad as the guys, sometimes the girls are worse than the guys, actually, because they feel they can get away with it,
The humor you hear in kitchens is really a lot like the humor you can hear in operating rooms, and that, you're talking about raw meat sitting on a table. In both instances, people with knives and blood, and sometimes that gallows humor can have sexual connotations. And now, I would say that that's not harassment, and I know other people who are offended by it and say it is. Maybe it's because I grew up with it, so to speak, in the kitchens.
You just kind of grow a skin around you, when it comes to that. And I think you have to be the kind of person that kind of can let something slide, that can let it go off your back. And and not everybody can do that.
Women have battled with sexual harassment and discrimination since their entry in the professional work world. There are conflicting reports on how much harassment and discrimination still exist in the kitchen.
In the old days, there was nothing but sexual discrimination and harassment. I mean, when I started working as a waitress in the 60s, it was worth your life to go into the kitchen. I mean, the kitchens were different. They were incredibly hot. The guys who ran them were these macho Europeans who got drunker as the night went on, and they couldn't keep their hands off anyone. I think that as the profession has changed, as it's become more professional, as you get better educated people in the kitchens, that's pretty much going away. I mean, certainly there is no profession that doesn't have a certain amount of sexual harassment, but I don't think that kitchens are any worse than any other place.
I got hit on a lot by dishwashers or by, even up to like the sous chefs and the wine sommeliers and cooks and everything. And sometimes it was like a welcome advance, and I ended up sort of having relationships with people who I worked with, and sometimes it wasn't, and it became sort of like a stress. But it happened a lot. I would say every job that I've had, whether I was waitressing or cooking or whatever, I've been harassed in some regard.
We had some guys who were just pigs, and you either had to, you just had to figure out a way how to deal with it. At least that was my perspective on it. We probably could have done something more. We probably could have, had legal action or something, but it just didn't seem worth it.
I just don't try to focus on like incidences that happen because you're a woman in the kitchen. You try not to focus on that, because if you do, you'll drive yourself nuts. I'm sure that most restaurant chefs don't have to hear, "Hey sweetie, hi babe," from every purveyor that you call up to make an order. It's so unprofessional to me.
A lot of being successful in a restaurant, especially if you want to move up in the ranks, has to do with who you know and what they think of you. And so if you can't handle the sexual harassment that inevitably exists in the kitchen, then maybe you can't handle being in the kitchen. The same as if you kept dropping plates and breaking them. Maybe you just can't handle it. If that's stressing you out, maybe it's not for you.
The first thing that people are asking, like, "Oh, you're not married? Are you engaged? Do you plan to get married? What's your life?" But like, they're asking personal questions that that's the first time I actually felt any sort of discrimination. Never did before, because I was always, really successful and, worked well, and I knew I was a really good chef, so I never really felt any of that until then.
While there is a dearth of women in East Coast kitchens, the West Coast has many female-run kitchens.
You will find many more women in business, women influencing food in California, Oregon, Washington than you do on the East Coast. The chefs on the East Coast are more of a European model, where in Europe that's who did this labor. It was not considered a profession, it was considered a labor.
New York City is a lot harder for a woman than, for example, LA or San Francisco. First of all, California kind of knows that women are people, and it's a lot harder in every field in New York City for women. The West is a more female-friendly environment in general, in the end.
I feel very fortunate to have started working on the East Coast and going to the West Coast because, I don't know, the work ethic is completely different.
California, it's always been cutting edge. It's been very cutting edge in terms of the food industry in general, but there's more women out there and there's more men who are friendly to women in the kitchen. It's really the best place to be.
California is the home to one of the most influential chefs. Alice Waters opened Chez Panisse in 1971 a time when there were few women chefs, never mind restaurant owners. Over the next 30 years, she influenced many aspects of the restaurant industry. There have been many efforts to encourage women to enter the field. Organizations such as WCR, Women Chefs and Restaurateurs, founded in 1993, promote education, advancement, and mentorship.
It was about 10 years ago that I helped to fund the Women Chefs and Restaurateur Group with Ann Cooper and Barbara Trapp and Ann Rosenzweig, and we were all together. And we felt that women out there did not have the network. Specifically, for economics, if they needed a loan, for somebody to turn to with questions. The organization has really blossomed, and within the organization we have a mentor program which we still mentor young people. So it's a continuum of first taking, then at a time giving back.
I think that the women's organizations have been really wonderful. I mean, I think that they've mentored women, they've helped women do things like job sharing, which makes it possible for many women to stay in the profession. They've, allowed women to give each other support, to suggest other places, to go work besides restaurants. In every profession, role models are hugely important. And I think, one of the things that's extraordinary about this business is how enormously generous chefs tend to be with one another and with the next generation. And because of the kind of collaborative nature of cooking, of working in a restaurant, because you really need a team, and because a chef is absolutely dependent on his entire brigade, I mean, in the kitchen and in the dining room, chefs really understand the need to mentor people, to constantly create the next generation, help the next generation, because they need them.
I think if you look at the West Coast, there's lots of role models, lots more, I should say. And I think that I don't see as many in the New York area. So I think, of course, that would always be a benefit to have people to look up to. And maybe, like I said, my mentor was a woman, and it made it a very easy transition for me, because I never felt, I don't know if I was always buffered by her, but there was always a respect there for her, so I never felt anything less for me.
Culinary schools across the country have seen a vast increase in matriculation, particularly women. Currently, approximately 36% of the students at CIA are female.
We have done a fair amount in terms of targeting women to bring them in. When we started our baking and pastry program, we then had a gigantic influx of women. And I think it's more a commentary on the restaurant industry rather than on the Culinary Institute of America.
When I was at the Culinary Institute, it was somewhat towards the beginning, not the absolute beginning, but a lot of the chefs were European, and they were they had been very negative, but a lot of them were beginning to realize that the women students were the best students. They were more serious, and so they really started to like the women students and to encourage them.
The TV Food Network has played a role in elevating the profession of a chef from an acceptable service industry job to a glamorous career choice.
It's been huge for the industry. I think that the respect for the industry has changed dramatically. I think that people understand the industry, but I think they're kind of wowed by it now where they weren't before. I think they hold chefs in a different, regard now than they ever did before. So I think it's been terrific for the industry. Even back then, when people said they want to go off and cook, it was almost like a menial thing. You want to be a blue-collar worker? What do you want to do that for? So, and I think now it's like, wow, it's really cool. And people are intrigued by it more than they are, put off by it.
The number of women in culinary school has increased significantly in the past decade. But where are all these women going after school?
We see more women going into management. We see more women going into front of the house. Now we see women sommeliers. We also see women as writers and teachers. But we're also seeing the field really diversify. So even if there aren't as many women in restaurant kitchens, there are a whole lot of other opportunities.
I was lucky enough after working in restaurants and hotels, I discovered executive dining rooms, which are incredible places for chefs to work because they're private dining rooms for places like banks and insurance companies where you have more quality of life, should I say, that your hours are not as extensive as in the hotel restaurant. So you're doing more like an 8-hour, 9-hour day with weekends off, holidays off. And so that was a good route for me.
Well, I know that there are more and more women going into cooking schools and becoming professional cooks. And I think that they're in restaurants, but not in the top jobs. They're catering, they are teaching cooking. I mean, the hospitality industry is the biggest industry in the United States. And there are thousands and thousands and thousands of jobs in cooking that, I mean, you can cook in hospitals, in convention centers. There are lots of places where you can cook that don't have to be restaurants. And I think one reason why you don't see so many women at the top place in restaurants is because as those women opt out of that, for instance, here at Gourmet, we have 11 full-time cooks. It's a great job. I mean, they're all they do is create recipes all day long. It's a 9-to-5 job. They make a lot of money. They get good benefits. And of our 11 cooks, 9 are women. There are a lot of jobs like that women go into.
More women in the industry because there are more facets of the industry. The Food Network opened up a whole door for food stylists and people who, you know, work behind the scenes that you don't see. You know, the whole personal chefs have opened up this whole new avenue. And it seems to me that it's mostly women that, you know, take those jobs.
Whereas in the industry today, still the majority of the women go into pastries. Pastries always seem to be the female domain. And I really can't even say why that is, but it always seemed when you would go for a job in a professional kitchen, the chefs would steer the ladies towards the pastries. Because it's sweet, they thought we were sweet, I don't know.
I think a lot of women go into pastry because it's a much easier job. It's much more manageable. I also think it's very artistic and precise in a way that appeals to women. I think it's an innate talent that a lot of women have to do pastry, but I think the double whammy of it being a very manageable job and also a place that women really can excel and get paid well is part of the reason.
Several of the women in my class chose baking and pastry because they didn't want to be in a male-dominated society. They didn't want to feel discriminated against or pushed aside or slighted or like they were less of a baker because of their gender. A lot of girls just said that they liked this better because of the comfort level they felt. They were just happier in an environment that wasn't so, I guess, domineering or masculine.
Probably is no real solution to the question of can you own a restaurant, a really successful restaurant, and have a real life. I mean, I don't know a single chef, male or female, who is at the top of his field who isn't working 18 or 19 hours a day.
I think the industry's changing. I think it's changing in a lot of ways. I think financially people figure out, you know, if I turn over cooks every 3 months, 6 months, whatever the case may be, I'm retraining these people each time. The quality of the product I'm creating is compromised, and if I'm going to make money, I've got to hire a skill set that I can grow to meet the needs of my business, and I have to make them happy.
We're seeing a place where the hospitality industry, the restaurant industry is becoming more professional, and while it comes before more professional, it's going to have to be equitable with other industries. So you wouldn't imagine going to work at a bank or at Walmart, for goodness sake. A manager at a Walmart gets a vacation, gets insurance, gets health care, and a chef should have those same things. We started to see more women coming into it in the early and mid 80s. And let's just say it takes 15 or 20 years to get to the top of a profession. We just haven't had enough women cycling through. You're seeing both men and women coming up in the industry together so that there's a lot less bias. I mean, when there were no women in culinary schools and guys got out into the industry and then women tried to get in, of course it was antithetical to them because they never grew up with that.
I think the high position thing, again, I think a lot of young people are coming out of school. And I don't think that a lot of young people yet have really reached, you know, that exact, I think you're going to see a lot more young people reaching those executive levels.
Most women get respected for the job they do. And if you can produce the food and if you've got a good palate and if you work hard, I think you get the accolades for that just like anybody else.
It doesn't have to be chaos and masculine sort of, we're going to fight this out and then we're going to sit out back on the dumpster and smoke cigarettes and talk about how we won the war against the customers that night, or it can just be a little more organized. Anyway, that's my ambition and idea of a successful restaurant, also that the food's very good.